John Hockenberry, failed mathematician and moderately successful radio host. I'm here to help us through this session. We've got an unbelievably lively and fabulous panel of authors to talk about all kinds of things, including their books. And here today, we are going to talk with a number of authors. And because of the diversity of authors that we have, I thought we would introduce people in a slightly different way. Imagine that science is like maybe a writer, a character, an actor, just somebody who needs to make like an elevator pitch, all right, for a story. And we've got 5 representatives here of very, very different stories. And I think what we learn from these 5 authors is just how vast the scope of science is. And it goes way beyond certainly textbooks, and it goes way beyond, I think, a lot of the books that some of us may have grown up with. But here's one. Here's an elevator pitch for our first author. Science is a detective chasing an industrial Jack the Ripper across time. That is a pretty decent elevator pitch for Tom's River by our first author, Dan Fagin, who's a professor here at NYU. Dan, come on out. Dan's a professor at NYU, one of the directors of the school's Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting program. Thanks for being here, Dan.
Great. Glad to be with you.
And let's do the pitch now for our second writer. Okay, this one I really love. Okay, all right, get this. Science is a vast old Victorian mansion in its heyday, but haunted by ghosts. Please welcome Rebecca Skloot, who's the author of this extraordinary book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. Hi, Rebecca. Rebecca's written about race and all kinds of scientific topics and is working on a new book and is also involved in the filming of this right now. Thank you so much for being here. And let's do the third pitch here. And this one's tough. This is Neal Stephenson, okay? So how do you come up with a pitch for Neal Stephenson, right? This is the best I could do. And I'm sure there are some of you here who could do way better than this. Science is an imaginative dream of the future in a wild dance with the present. Please welcome Neal Stephenson, whose latest book out this week is 7 Eves. Anyway, I've got so many questions for you, Neal. I am a huge fan. I'm a huge fan of all of you guys, but Neal and I go back a ways, even though we don't know each other. All right, number 4 here. Number 4. Science is a puzzle, and solving the puzzle is a matter of life and death. That's a reasonable pitch for David Quammen's remarkable The Chimp and the River. David, please welcome. David Quammen, of course, is the byline at National Geographic and Outside Magazine, and came here from Montana, which deserves an award in and of itself. Thank you, David.
Great to be here.
And number 5, dear, great, fabulous spirit, who I am such a huge fan of. For our next author, the pitch is science is a song of civilization being sung by this motley choir of planet-chomping humanity. The Human Age, which is Diane Ackerman's latest book. Diane, please go. So let's just begin, as my mic is making all this noise here, let's begin. What do we think of this idea of a genre of science writing, one way or another? Quick thoughts on that. Begin with you, David.
Oh, thanks, John. I'm all in favor of it.
Yeah, of course you are.
Well, it's been around for a long time, but I think that one of the most basic things to be said about it is that we live in a heyday of it. We live in an age when there is a lot of really excellent, imaginative, artful writing about the factual material of science. And when I started as a writer, I started as a fiction writer, discovered that I couldn't make a living writing fiction and that the world didn't need me as a white male from a happy child in Ohio to be a fiction writer. And then I discovered this all of this wonderful nonfiction writing about science, and I said, hey, that's great stuff. That's artful. I want to try and do that.
Yeah, Sherwood Anderson did the Happy Ohioans. He kind of covered that ground pretty well. But that's great because it talks about how science speaks to your core. Diane, how does science speak to your core of curiosity and meaning?
Well, I don't actually think of it as science. I just think of it all as nature. So, and that's part of the revolution that's been taking place, is that we've been able to write about nature in the widest sense, so that it now, in addition to, cornflowers and so on.
So you're happy to be allowed to write about quarks?
I'm happy to be able to make my own astonishment and follow my curiosity and be in a field now where you can just wake up one morning and say, I wonder why snails use love darts, and just run with it and write about it and find out.
Why do snails use love darts? Since you brought it up.
Well, their sex organs are behind an ear, just for openers, so you get a good visual of this. And they pull these arrows, these darts, out of their quiver, I'll call it. And they're made of calcium, and they stab each other during foreplay. That's all I can tell you now for, a PG audience.
Romance.
Yeah.
I love it. Neal, how does science represent some core of your sort of outlook on the world?
Right now I have a scientific problem.
Oh, you take a rest, Henrietta.
Yeah.
Henrietta, this is not the first time I've been
Because like Jeopardy, pass. Henrietta, can you take it?
Rebecca.
Or
Yes.
Rebecca,
I
right.
get called any version. I'm often Rebecca Lacks, Henrietta Skloot.
Drink some water, John.
Yeah.
Yeah, I came to writing about science as a science person, so I wasn't planning to be a writer. To me, it all started with science, and I often tell my students that I think it's incredibly valuable as a writer to have a sort of specialty, just in terms of actually making a living and getting to tell the stories you want to tell. But then I also say, in terms of my own writing, that when I talk to the public, I say, I just tell stories. I tell really amazing stories that capture me, and it's that following your curiosity. That I use that line all the time, that's what I get to do for a living. And they sort of happen to be about science, is the way I like to pitch them to people, because people are often afraid of reading about science. And I think, to me, the fact that I get to write about science is, there's a sort of mission behind it for me. I think it's so important for people to have access to scientific information, in your day-to-day life, whether it's people going to the doctor, voting for, whichever presidential candidate. Science it's always part of the campaigns, and making decisions constantly throughout life has to do with science, but so many people have this enormous sort of barrier between them and science. So to me, this storytelling is it's a vehicle to get people to understand the science that I think that everyone needs to understand.
Confusing you with Henrietta is actually a product of the narrative, because in some ways you are so tied up with the story. There are some very unscientific reasons that you describe as to the curious power that the story has. So talk about that a little bit.
Do you mean the sort of supernatural?
Yeah, I mean, those Lacks, they understand the world in a different way than I do, that's
absolutely.
for sure.
And so, so the story is about the first immortal human cells that were ever grown in culture, and they were taken from Henrietta Lacks in the 50s without her knowledge. She died soon after. And to her family, they had no scientific background at all. They had no basic education. Her husband didn't even know what a cell was. So when he first found out these cells were alive decades after her death, he thought they had her alive in a lab, in a cell, like a prison cell. That was his frame of reference for a cell. And for them, she was the Lord's first immortal being. If you read the Bible and the description of, immortality in the Bible, to them, she was an angel brought back to life to take care of people and cure diseases and occasionally cause problems if you piss her off. And
because they understood that her tissue continued to live.
So eventually they came to understand that the cells were not all of her, but they were part of her, and her DNA was in there alive, even though she was dead. And at a certain point, they came to believe that she had sort of picked me and essentially been working me as a puppet my whole life. Go over here and study science, go over here and study writing, and driving this story to happen. And when I first started working on the book, I am a science person. I had never entertained the idea of cells being an actual person who's still alive outside, in a lab, and that their soul could somehow be alive in these cells. And also, I'm not a religious person. The Lacks family was deeply religious. And one of the big lessons for me in this story was, we often talk about science versus religion and the ways that these things are at odds. And with the Lacks family, I saw the way that their faith and their belief in this sort of supernatural really helped them find a way to understand the science, and it kind of opened it up for them.
The way you include that in the story, and I'll have a couple of examples of that a little bit later, in surprising ways just added so much humanity to the story. For those of you who don't know the science of her cells, and probably most of you do know that, is that the cancer that she had continued to reproduce over and over and over again, and it made a tissue culture that was continually usable and therefore testable for all kinds of medical research uses, and became a commodity, almost like an agricultural commodity, like saffron or something like that, really valuable. People wanted it, only incredibly much more valuable, and the family saw no benefit from that, and we'll talk about what that meant a little bit later. You teach science journalism, right? That's, you're here in the academy. I mean, that's a category, that's a box it's got a little name on it and everything. But you've lived the era of journalism that's probably the most radical changed profession, short of, I don't even want to mention one that's more changed. We could both tell pretty sad stories of our changed profession, but where do you figure science journalism is these days?
Wow, okay. That's a huge question. I'm sort of the mirror image of Becca in that I came to this as a journalist, not as a science person. In fact, no one would be more surprised than every science teacher I've ever had to know that I'm a professor of science journalism. I thought that I was going to be a political writer, and that's what I had trained to be, and that's what I did for a while. And what I realized was that the science that I had learned in school was a lot of rote memorization, and science is so much more than that. Science is a way of thinking. It's an approach to understanding reality. And I got really excited about that after covering politics and feeling like a stenographer for years and years, where you just, okay, I'm going to find a Democrat, I'm going to find a Republican, okay, my work is done, let's go have a cocktail. I never really felt like I was anything more than just a court reporter, just sort of writing down what people said. But I discovered environmental issues, and then through covering the environment, discovered science, and realized that, wow, there is actually a process that helps us understand what reality actually is. And we can never completely get there. We can never understand reality in all its complexity, but we can approach ever closer. And so this idea of somehow blending storytelling and the scientific process of knowledge acquisition was so exciting to me that I gravitated toward it and have been incredibly happy doing it ever since, and teaching it. And I agree with what David said, that we have so many great science storytellers right now doing amazing work. We have a little problem in the sense that it's really hard to get them paid adequately for their work. There's a little thing called the internet that has drastically changed the business models for journalism. But the thirst for storytelling about science is stronger than ever, and the people who are quenching that thirst are more talented than ever, including my students, some of whom are here. And that's exciting to me, and I'm thrilled to be a part of it more than ever.
Well, tell me how much of this book, Tom's River, is certainly a journalistic exercise to get to the bottom of a contaminated pollution story,
Right.
But also a course of study to discover the differences between industrial science and environmental science.
Yeah, that's true. Books are never only about one thing, although one of the things first your agent and then your publisher will tell you is your book can only be about one thing. But that's not really true. Books can be about many things if they somehow unite to form a cohesive whole. And so Tom's River at one level is a chronicle of what happened in a town. At a deeper level, it's about how do we know what we think we know about the relationship between the world in which we live and these really difficult chronic diseases with long latency periods like cancer. What do we know? And even more interesting than that is, how do we know what we know? And how confident can we be? And then what do we do with that knowledge? Those are fascinating questions to me, and they're questions that science can and does answer. And in very sort of, narrative-friendly ways, in ways that really lend themselves to good storytelling. And that's exciting to me too. Science, the scientific process is a narrative. It's a narrative that begins with the identification of a hypothesis and then testing of that hypothesis and then figuring out, okay, that's not quite right, so let's refine our hypothesis and do some more testing. That's a story. And I think that's another reason why there's so much thirst out there for good science stories, because science itself is an amazing story that is part of this sort of epic quest of humankind to understand nature, understand the nature of nature. And we inch ever closer, but we have so much that we still don't understand, and that's what makes it so damn interesting.
And Neal, you're okay, right?
Worked out an accommodation with the excellent sound crew here when I'm going to turn my mic on and off to minimize the number of biological sound effects that
Excellent.
come over my channel.
Excellent. Well, let me ask you about, scientists are known, the greatest scientists, I would use cosmologists as maybe the most current examples, but they're by no means the only examples, have great imaginations, wild, insane imaginations, dare to think things that others won't. I think your imagination is pretty heroic. Which comes first, the imagination or the science in the stories that you tell?
The stories that I tell, a lot of them begin with some kind of scientific idea that I think looks like it might serve as the basis of an interesting yarn. And then it kind of goes from there. So, for example, I wrote a trilogy called the Baroque Cycle that started with two random observations that were mentioned to me by different friends at about the same time. And one of them mentioned the fact that Sir Isaac Newton was fascinated by alchemy and spent his last few decades running the mint at the Tower of London, which is pretty weird. And the other thing was that Leibniz sort of was one of the earliest computer scientists, and these two guys lived at the same time. They were the smartest two guys in the world, and they hated each other. So when I heard those two things, I just said, this is a story. There has to be a story here. I have to write this.
And they each independently invented the calculus.
Yeah, isn't it the fact that we attribute calculus generally to Newton, but we use Leibniz's notation?
Yeah, I think more so in the English-speaking countries, it's attributed to, at least for a while, it tended to be attributed to Newton because of the nationalistic passions that got stirred up during that dispute. But yeah, Leibniz's notation, the elongated S for integration and the little d for differentiation, and all of that is the notation that he used.
So Snow Crash really is about the fact that World War II was actually about the dispute between Leibniz and Newton over notation.
Well, yeah, the notation thing is a footnote, as it were, but this is, it plays out, that story plays out later in Cryptonomicon, which is about code breaking and so on in World War II.
Let's go on some of the individual books right now. Dan, let's talk about Tom's River. And Describe the problems and the narrative that you discovered in dealing with statistics as the people in Toms River attempted to determine what it was that was going wrong with them, and lawyers, et cetera, were attempting to prove a case that was very difficult to prove.
Right, right. Well, that really forms one of the core issues of the book. You know, Toms River, I hate to describe it this way because it makes the book sound boring, but Toms River is really a book about epidemiology, which is a long word that stands for something very simple, which is patterns over time and space and the interpretation of patterns. And the thing about the human brain is that it's pretty good at interpreting patterns, but it's far from perfect. And so people have been making maps of disease since John Snow. I'm talking about the epidemiologist John Snow, by the way, for all you Game of Thrones people out there. Ever since John Snow did
Put the specimen in the cave.
Right.
Yeah.
This John Snow didn't go around wearing heavy skins and prancing around tall walls. He made a map of cholera cases in the Soho section of London that I'm sure many of you are familiar with that story, and launched modern epidemiology, launched the modern practice of epi. So the thing about maps is that, or the thing about clusters, which is really what we're talking about when we're talking about patterns, points of information over time or space, is that sometimes clusters mean something and sometimes they don't. And how can we figure that out? Sometimes we see a pattern and it's just bad luck. It's just random. Sometimes we see a pattern and it actually means something. There's some very elaborate science that has arisen to try to figure out what these patterns mean. And one of the central dramas in Toms River is between a sort of a naive but very passionate understanding of what this pattern means and the scientific approach. And there was plenty of disagreement within the scientific community about how best to interpret those patterns as well.
And these were patterns in the deformation of DNA? Is that what you're looking at?
No, well, that's a different kind. That's molecular epidemiology, which is a whole other subject. But in this case, I'm really talking about cases. You see a number of cases in a neighborhood, and you say, well, what does that really mean? A lot of people on my block are sick. What does that mean? And as a reporter, before I even got to the Toms River story, I was constantly hearing from people when I was a newspaper reporter saying, why are so many people sick on my block, in the post office where I work, in the factory where I work, whatever. And so, this was a survival. This was one of the ways that we survived on the savannah, right? By doing these sort of heuristic shortcuts to interpret patterns. Well, a very elaborate science has evolved to try to figure out what those patterns really mean. And Toms River is one of those places where this process played out, and it played out in a landscape, a very fascinating landscape, full of very passionate people who did not agree with each other, and then a lot of outside experts who came in to try to figure out what those patterns really mean. And in the end, to everyone's shock, a very credible, very elaborate scientific study determined that yes, the patterns of childhood cancer in Toms River do not appear, at least some of them, do not appear to be random events, and they did indeed appear to be linked to exposure to specific kinds of pollution from a couple of Superfund sites in town. And that was a shock because epidemiology is often full of false negatives. And this was not one of those situations, and the way that unspooled was really incredibly dramatic and a very, very powerful narrative, and also really a wonderful illustration of the power of science. This town was, once the news got out about the existence of the cluster. You know, this town was a tinderbox. All kinds of incredibly overwrought emotion. I say overwrought, but actually it's quite justifiable. Their fear was very understandable. And yet, it turns out there was a way to shed light on their fears, to try to figure out which of those fears were evidence-based and which were not. And that's exactly what happened in Tom's River. And in that way, Tom's River to me is actually a very hopeful story, even though it's a story about toxic waste and cancer and all kinds of awful things. It's also a story of hope about how science can illuminate, if not the truth, at least inching our way closer to the truth in a way that can actually improve people's lives. And well, that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, because I wanted to show that, and I also wanted to show that in other parts of the world that are going through the process now that Tom's River went through, that there's hope for them too, if we are willing to invest in good science to try to figure out what's really going on.
Well, it is amazing how the power of something being knowable in the end after so much confusion is such a positive element, even in a story about cancer and toxic waste.
Yeah.
Diane, why is this book so positive and joyful? Because it really does describe how naughty we are as humans on the planet, wrecking the place.
Well, there's no doubt. We've created a lot of planetary chaos that we didn't mean to. But I think the didn't mean to part is very important. If you think about what we could do on purpose this time, that is also extraordinary. So I'm very much a realist about what we've done, not just to the planet, but to our own evolution as well in different ways. But also very optimistic, because as I've been studying what people have been doing all over the world, I've been finding that we really do have the tenacity and the talent and the ingenuity to be able to change the world again for the better this time. But we do have to get busy and wake up and start doing it. I don't think in the past, in the previous century, we were very pessimistic as environmentalists, and we didn't get very far with people to get them motivated. I don't think paralyzing people with gloom and doom and fear is the way to go.
Let me give you an example, or you hear an example, and some of you have probably already read passages like this, but this is just something that is an absolute treasure to read. Offshore in Jamaica, you write, I once swam through a button collector's variety of vividly colored fish. Let's just savor that for a moment. And was so spellbound that one hand automatically touched my chest and my eyes teared. My guide's eyes questioned me through the fishbowl of his face mask. There was no way to mime that I wasn't hurt or frightened, but jubilant, merely glad to the brink of tears. How do you scuba sign wonder? And then this led to a whole sort of rumination about tears in the ocean, and in fact there's an ocean in me, and I'm looking at this coral reef. And only then do you describe that 20 years ago you saw that, and today it's what?
It's quite bleached and dead today, the same place. Well, this separation of ourselves from the rest of nature, that primary story that we were living by, I think has gotten us into a lot of trouble. And it's not true. We now know that on the microscopic level, we are only ever in communication with the rest of the world, and that we only exist through our senses in relation to nature and to each other, and that we're now creating an environment that rivals the natural environment, our human environment, in which we're kind of embedding nature. So I needed to look at everything in the largest picture. I've only ever been interested in both nature and human nature, and especially how they're related together. So this was an ideal opportunity to do that, to write about how our relationship with all the different facets of nature is changing.
And you begin with orangutans and iPads?
Yes, because there is a program of apps for apes in which orangutans around the world are being given iPads because they're very smart. and they need mental enrichment. And
Dolphins using touchpads, that's in your book?
Yeah, I visited one. He Skypes. That's more than I can do.
He's great. You've got Peter Gabriel jamming with some apes.
Well, that's true. And he is actually, he's putting into motion the interspecies internet. Because heaven forbid we don't have the rest of the animals involved with our, digital fantasies that we live with.
Oh, no, don't, please. Yeah.
Don't go there. But he wants other intelligent animals to be able to communicate with each other more openly and with us and so on. So yes, I was looking into that as well.
And you describe it as evolution in practice, that here we are as a part of a biosphere, an ecosystem. We're not the enemy of the ecosystem. Look at the ways in which we are a part of the ecosystem, and that is
for good and bad.
For good and bad, and that's
in both ways.
Right.
And that we are not at all doomed, although unfortunately that really is the message that we get through the media all the time, that we are an evil species, all of us, which just isn't true, and that we have irrevocably ruined the planet, and that isn't true either. The UN panel on climate change says that it's real, it's urgent, we need to tend to it immediately, but the worst possible scenarios are not inevitable, that we have the talent and the capabilities to curb things. So the hardest part for me was not making the whole book about that, about climate change, and somehow finding a way to have, to integrate that with what's happening in robotics and artificial intelligence and epigenetics and what we're learning medically now about ourselves. And for me, it was waking up every single day and just being stunned by what I was learning. I love that.
David, you have a story in your book about epidemiology that really was so moving. And first of all, this is a story that takes us back to the 1970s and the 80s and the discovery of AIDS and the way in which it was a scourge in the United States and around the world. But then we're on a journey to discover what really was the transmission moment of AIDS into the human population. And at one point in the book, you take us to a university in Zaire, a pathologist, epidemiologist, a doctor who saves specimens. Can you describe that place and what it was like to be there and the characters that you met there?
Yeah. This reflects one of my cardinal principles of nonfiction writing about science. I've got a handful of them, and I won't recite them all, but one of them is go there. Go there. And it's not always possible financially or physically, but often it is, especially if you're fortunate enough, as we are, to have a little bit of financial support for your work. That particular, that book, the little book, The Chimp in the River, is part of the larger book, and it's hard for me to talk about it separate from the larger book that it comes from, Spillover, which was 2012. But I wrote it as a set piece within Spillover, so when my publisher said, let's publish it separately, just the story of the ecological origins of the AIDS pandemic, I said, fine, yeah, I would like to do that. And at the core of that is a couple of stories, but one of them is the story of two specimens, the two very earliest HIV positive specimens from humans. And one of them was known to science as early as the late 90s, and it was given the name, the genetic sequence of this HIV positive specimen was called ZR59, because it had been taken from a man who lived in what then was the country Zaire, in what later was the country Zaire, in 1959, at the point when it was still the Belgian Congo. And it was frozen, and it was rediscovered in the 90s, and that's when it was named ZR59, because it came from the year 1959. Here was a man who had a blood sample taken, and it had been frozen for all those years, and retrospectively it was screened and discovered to have been HIV positive. He was living in what then was Leopoldville, the capital of the Belgian Congo. And then there was a second specimen that was discovered, came to the attention of a scientist named Michael Warraby, and that was a tissue biopsy from a woman also in Leopoldville, Belgian Congo, in 1960. At the point when that was discovered, the country now is called DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo. So that specimen was named DRC 60. It's very confusing because the names were changing, and but two specimens, one from 1959 and one from 1960. And when their genetic sequences were compared, and the degree of difference between them was traced back using molecular clock assumptions, this fellow, Michael Warraby, established that AIDS had been in the human population since at least 1908, give or take a margin of error. So he placed the beginning of the AIDS pandemic in time using those two specimens and a comparison between them. And I read about this and I said, go there. So I went to, I happened to be in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and I went to the University of Kinshasa, as it was then, and found this man, Jean-Marie Kabongo, this wonderful little Congolese man with big mutton chops wearing a white coat, who was head of the pathology department. And I said, I've come to see where that specimen resided, where it was, until it was rediscovered by Michael Warraby and his colleagues. And this man took me through this pathology lab, and he pushed aside a blue curtain and revealed a little dusty, disorganized pantry filled with tissue specimens preserved in paraffin, and showed me that this was the place where that specimen had sat for 45 or 50 years at room temperature in the Congo, preserved in paraffin, until it had found its way out of there, first to Belgium and then to the University of Arizona, where Michael Warraby extracted the DNA and sequenced it.
It's a miracle of science. And the idea that this sort of random, that these quiet little priests and choir boys of pathology and whatever are taking this data and putting it away, and it stays preserved, and it helps to solve a puzzle that's absolutely crucial, because of course AIDS, as you describe in this book, completely changes our understanding of what infectious disease is all about.
Right, yeah. And it's, I mean, people like to read about people like to read about mystery stories. And I've said that before about this particular mystery and the others, emerging diseases that I've described in Spillover. It was a very enjoyable book, and in some ways an easy book to write, because every new emerging disease, including this horrible one, AIDS, including Ebola virus disease, every one of these new diseases begins as a mystery story. And the disease detectives, the epidemiologists, and the veterinary ecologists, the people who go out and investigate these mysteries to figure out what is this new virus, where does it come from, how does it get into people. They're the Sam Spades, they're the Philip Marlowes of these stories. And it's fun to tell those stories.
Well, if the mission is to tell human stories, you can't get much better than this from page 266 of The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. This is a scene that, as you read this book, Rebecca, you wonder if it actually exists, this scene, and you wonder if it can actually, if this journalist, this writer can actually witness such a scene, and in fact, you do. And basically you connect Christoph, who's a doctor, a cancer researcher, oncology, yeah, who's who's had a bit of a soul searching about what the scientific community has done with the cells of Henrietta Lacks throughout this time, and has gone to see Deborah, Henrietta's daughter, and Zachariah, who's the son.
I won't tell him you said it like that.
Okay, Zachariah. And Christoph actually, and I'll just read the words, taught Deborah and Zachariah how to use the microscope, saying, look through like this, take your glasses off, now turn this knob to focus. Finally, the cells popped into view for Deborah. And through that microscope, for that moment, all she could see was an ocean of her mother's cells, stained an ethereal fluorescent green. "They're beautiful," she whispered, then went back to staring at the slide in silence. Eventually, without looking away from the cells, she said, "God, I never thought I'd see my mother under a microscope. I never dreamed this day would ever come." It's a line you should say for the movie, by the way. "Yeah, Hopkins pretty much screwed up, I think," Christoph said, that's the oncologist, and Deborah bolted upright and looked at him, stunned to hear a scientist, one at Hopkins no less, saying such a thing. Then she looked back into the microscope and said, "John Hopkins is a school for learning, and that's important, but this is my mother. Nobody seemed to get that." That's amazing stuff. What was it like to be in that room?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the most sort of incredible and emotional, sort of overwhelming moments in the reporting. I mean, there were so many of them, but that, there had been such a build up to that moment. I had been working on the book for over 6 years at that point, and it took me about 1.5 years just to get Deborah to talk to me. We had one phone call where she was really excited about the idea of somebody writing a book about her mother and the cells, and said, well, maybe then I'll be able to learn what the cells actually did in science. No one had ever explained anything to the family. Maybe I'll be able to learn who my mother was. But then sort of in the next breath, she's like, but how do I know you're really a journalist? How do I know you're not coming to steal my cells? And I was like, what? Why would you possibly think that? And then she essentially hung up on me and then wouldn't talk to me for 1.5 years. And in that moment, there are these things when I talk about the sort of origins of a lot of my stories, they always start with something that I call a what moment, like something that just makes me stop and go, wait, what? What did you just say? And that was a big one for me. The first one was just learning about Henrietta's cells in the first place. And there's this woman, and she's been dead since the 50s, but her cells are still around, and they're one of the most important things that happened to medicine, but her family didn't know. And that sort of moment, I just went, wait. And I learned about her in a biology class at 16, and my teacher wrote her name on the board and said she was a black woman, and that was it. And I was like, what? Why do we just know that? Like, that's it? And I went up to him and said, what else do we know? And he was just like, sorry, that's all we know about her. And so that was sort of the first moment in this that grabbed my curiosity. And then so much of the rest of reporting for me is just following the curiosity. So when I first called Deborah, I thought I was writing a story about Henrietta and these amazing cells. And then that moment on the phone when Deborah said, how do I know you're really a journalist? How do I know you're not coming to steal my cells? I could hear how she was so excited to talk to me and so terrified at the same time. And it was another big what moment where I said, I have to figure out why she's so afraid of me. Something else happened in this story. This isn't just about Henrietta. Something happened to her kids. And really, the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks is sort of the legacy of the cells and the impact on her children. It turned out they had been used in research without their knowledge in the 70s in order to learn more about the cells, and scientists never told them that they were used in research. So really, it's a story of multiple generations of a family used in research. And so for Deborah, it took years to get her to talk to me, and then to win her trust. And there was just kind of constant moments where she would push me away, sometimes literally physically threw me against a wall, like, who sent you? And then she would calm down, and she would always come back to me and say, I know this has all got to go in the book. This is not about you. This is part of the story of what happened when the world got HeLa cells and I lost my mother, which is everyone has benefited personally from this. Vaccines, you've got a kid born through IVF, like whatever it is, everyone has benefited in multiple ways, except her family. And they didn't have access to medical care. They didn't get the money that people made off of it. So there was this long process of over years of sort of winning her trust and building up in some ways to that. That was the first of sort of 3 moments that we had together that really changed the story for me and for her. But for her, voluntarily walking through the doors of Hopkins was the most terrifying thing you could do. So in East Baltimore, to this day, if you grow up there and you're a black child, you grow up hearing that you don't go out on the street you don't go out on the streets after dark because Hopkins will snatch you and take you in the basement and do research on you and you'll never come out. And this is something that dates back to slavery time and after that, when there were these things that people referred to as night doctors, and they did do research on African Americans. There's a long history of this, but Hopkins never did that directly. But there were a lot of other things it did to engender a lot of mistrust in the community. After the book came out, I did one of my first speaking events there I walked out of the event afterwards. There was a girl, she was about 13 years old, waiting outside the building to talk to me. And she came up, she's like, I'm so excited to talk to you, I have all these questions. And I said, well, why, I was like, you should have come, it was me. And she said, oh, I can't go into Hopkins because they'll take me in the basement and I'll never go home. And so it's that alive today. I mean, this was just a few years ago. And so, so Deborah grew up in that and grew up knowing they'd done something to Henrietta, and there was a lot of questions about whether they'd given her cancer in order to do the research, which they hadn't. But so for her to just walk through those doors into a research lab took an amount of courage that I'd sort of never really even imagined or seen before. And she did it with this incredible grace, and she was afraid, but it was a beautiful thing. And the moment right before that part you read, she actually saw the cells in a refrigerator for the first time. The researcher opened it, and there were just these hundreds of vials of hemocells, and he was explaining to her what these cells were. And he handed her a vial, and she took it, and she sort of rubs it in her hands and starts blowing on it and saying, she's cold because she's been in the refrigerator. And then she starts talking to her mother. She just picks up the cells and starts talking to it as if it's her mother. And then that was sort of the next thing that happened was, he said, let me come show them to you outside of that tube.
She also asked the question, I believe, how come they're not black?
That was her brother, yeah. And that was, I think for Christoph, that was an incredible revelation. I mean, he didn't, if you don't know what a cell is, and you've grown up in the South, in the midst of segregation, and, it never crossed her son's mind that her cells didn't look black, just like, her skin. And it was a beautiful moment. And Christoph is an amazing scientist. I mean, he reached out to me and said, I had written a magazine article about Henrietta, and he was like, I did my dissertation on these cells. Everything I've done in my career, I did with these cells, and I feel like I owe so much to her. And I'm sort of horrified that no one's ever explained these cells to them. Can you bring them to me, and can I explain this to them, please? And it was a beautiful thing to watch, and he was so excited, and they were just sort of laughing at him at various points because he was so giddy. It was like Bruce Springsteen had just walked in his lab when Henrietta's son walked in. He was just beside himself, and they'd just never been taken seriously before. So there were so many things in that moment that were happening, and I, sort of as a journalist, was just, experiencing all that. And at that point, I'd known the family for so long, I knew what this meant for them. And I've got my tape recorder, and I've got my cameras, and I got my notebooks, and I'm trying to do the journalist thing, and then every once in a while I go, wow, that's really amazing. Okay, and
Well,
so
nicely done, Ms. Skloot, I have to say. And at the risk of a cutesy segue, we never go into Hopkins because they'll steal our cells does sound like a Stephenson line. Let's talk about Seven Eves for a moment. It begins with a cataclysmic event that breaks the moon into 7 pieces, and you describe it in vivid scientific detail, and then we understand the Newtonian mechanics that would explain what would happen after that, which is also equally terrifying. I get the sense that planet Earth isn't quite enough for you, that you wish you maybe had seen a supernova, that possibly you wish that some of the extreme forces of the universe we had a better seat for here on Earth.
Well, we do have a remarkably good seat. I think sometimes we don't know it. One of the things that I picked up, so reading background information for Seven Eves, was that when the Chelyabinsk meteorite came in a couple of years ago, some of you may have seen the dashboard footage that was collected by various kind of incredibly calm, insouciant Russian drivers of this event, and the thing that comes through is how bright it was compared to the sun. It turns out that people who were standing in the open who looked up at that thing going overhead were sunburned. So even though the event only lasted for a few moments, the amount of UV that they took in during those moments was enough to give them facial sunburns so bad that a few days later they peeled, which tells you that from sort of some pretty elementary physics, that the heat there was such that the light coming off of that bolide was more like the light of an arc welder than, say, the light of a candle flame. And there's a different, but since you asked, I'll put it in the same bucket. There's some other research I came across in writing a story about a tall tower last year, where there was a satellite in orbit around the Earth whose purpose was to pick up gamma ray bursts from very far away, from deep space, and they kept maxing out the sensor on this thing. They would see a spike so big that the sensor was overloaded and couldn't record the data, and they couldn't figure out what on Earth or what off Earth could possibly cause a gamma ray spike of that intensity. Finally, they figured out that they were coming from below, and that the timing of these gamma ray bursts happened to coincide with big thunderstorms that were happening down in the atmosphere underneath. And eventually they figured out that there are these incredible cascades of electrons and positrons going up and down in big storm towers that produce, well, first of all, positrons are antimatter. So we have like significant amounts of antimatter in thunderstorms, and one of the things that comes out of those is bursts of gamma ray activity so powerful that if you're flying through one in a plane, when it hits you, it'll give you your lifetime dose of gamma radiation in a moment. And it doesn't happen to people because people try to avoid flying through incredibly violent thunderstorms. So it's kind of a self-correcting problem.
But if you did want antimatter, that would be the way to get it.
Yeah, yeah. So the and these things manifest themselves high above the atmosphere as these sprites, these flashes of light that look like kind of red jellyfish hanging above the atmosphere that last for a fraction of a second and then fade away. So there are sort of maybe not supernovas, but almost comparably amazing phenomena that happen around us all the time, and we may not just be aware of.
And everything you just told us is science fact. Is that right, Neal?
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, as filtered through my kind of popularizing narrative. Yeah, it's all. This is all. You can go look this stuff up. And
what was your original career track?
Oh well, I don't think I ever had a career track, but I studied physics in college, and ended up getting sort of seduced into geography of all things, because they were doing lots of cool stuff with computers, and also because it made me feel like I might be able to do something useful kind of with environmentalism. But in the geography, in the cartography lab at the geography department, they had the first sort of computer graphics displays that I had ever been able to get my hands on and play with, and that was pretty addictive. So anyway, I came out with a sort of mishmash degree that turned out to be unmarketable, and so I took.
Aren't they all?
Yeah,
Well done.
I took a couple years off and wrote a couple of novels just to see if that would work, and I assumed I'd go to grad school, but ended up publishing one of those novels, and then that was my career track from then on.
Well, congratulations on all of that. Let's talk a little bit about the fact that we've had 2 movies this year about mathematicians, and of course we've just the passing of Mr. Nash because of not wearing a seatbelt in the back seat of a taxi cab, but it's happened to Bob Simon, happened to Princess Diana. Someone will write an article about that. But anyway, the Nash movie was a breakthrough movie in terms of science, but I'm interested in how, I mean, did you see The Imagination Game?
Yeah,
The Imitation
The Imitation Game,
yeah.
excuse me, The
Yeah.
Imitation Game. Did you see it?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it's probably good that they did that movie, but I mean, I suspect you would give it a pretty dreadful review.
Well, I sort of turned to my friend George Dyson, who knows more about this stuff than I do. And I heard him talking about this just a couple of weeks ago at a conference. He interviewed a lot of people who knew Turing for his book, Turing's Cathedral. And he said, interestingly, that the thing about the Imitation Game that he found most objectionable was not that they sort of rearranged the story in order to make it fit into a movie, because you kind of expect that, but that Turing was actually a really nice guy.
Right.
And everyone who knew him talked about what a sweet person he was and how well he got along with his coworkers and just what a great guy he was. But they went for the sort of stereotypical portrayal of him as a remote jerk.
No, and here, I mean, as I was watching that movie, I so dreamed if it in fact had been a screenplay that came from Cryptonomicon, which has Alan Turing and some others as characters in a much bigger story. But here, in just a few lines, you convey a sense of Alan Turing in all of his controversy that I think is some absolutely beautiful fiction writing, if you'll permit me. Al delicately asked him one day if Lawrence is the character that is invented by Neal here, Al delicately asked him one day if Lawrence would terribly mind calling him by his full and proper name, which was Alan, and not Al, which is the moment you begin to suspect that this person is somebody maybe really big in the science world. Lawrence apologized and said he would try very hard to keep it in mind. One day, a couple of weeks later, as the two of them sat by a running stream in the woods above the Delaware Water Gap, they were at the Institute for Advanced Study at that time at Princeton, Alan made some kind of an outlandish proposal to Lawrence involving penises. It required a great deal of methodical explanation, which Alan delivered with lots of blushing and stuttering. He was ever so polite and several times emphasized that he was acutely aware that not everyone in the world was interested in this sort of thing. Lawrence decided that he was probably one of those people. Alan seemed vastly impressed that Lawrence had paused to think about it at all and apologized for putting him out. They went directly back to a discussion of computing machines, and their friendship continued unchanged. But on their next bicycle ride, an overnight camping trip to the Pine Barrens, they were joined by a new fellow, a German named Rudy, von something or other, who figures prominently in the novel. Alan and Rudy's relationship seemed closer, or at least more multi-layered than Alan and Lawrence's. Lawrence concluded that Alan's penis scheme must have finally found a taker. I mean, it's funny, it's human, it's sensitive, and it's scientific fact. I mean, it's basically based on biographical, factual details in a science fiction novel. There are not many people who can do that sort of thing. I applaud you, sir.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thanks. So.
What did you love? Gödel's in this book, Turing. What do you make of that whole character of mathematicians at the time and what they achieved? Because in some sense you try to smush them together with some of the mathematicians of our age and what could be achieved if they all were in the same room together.
Well, they belong to a kind of heroic age, I think, of logic and mathematics that doesn't come around very often. It may not come around again, but there was this moment when a number of threads kind of came together during the 1930s, and a number of fundamental problems were solved that all kind of turned out to be kind of the same problem, and the story of computing emerges from that confluence, and that is really one of the most remarkable stories in history, even just by itself. But when you fold that together with the fact that these same people were instrumental in winning the biggest war in history by doing math, the story just breaks through into a realm that's completely unbelievable. I mean, it's just beyond anything that you could even consider writing down in a work of fiction. And so it's kind of the point where fiction writers, I think, just have to, just sort of back away, and you can maybe talk about it, you can maybe tell that story in a fictionalized way, but that's the point where you just have to bow to the true full weirdness of science and what has happened in the last century, and become more a storyteller than a story creator, I guess.
A quick final question, and that would be, what do you think the responsibility of your readers is to understand science, or the readers of the future is to understand science in any significant way? Diane?
It's funny, as you were saying that, I was thinking more what my responsibility is, our responsibility, to help them discover the marvel and the mystery that it surrounds us every day in a way that is so fascinating. They don't have to want to do science. I don't want to do science. I love the revelations of science and the big picture that it allows us to see ourselves in. And I think, as much as anything, that falls on us.
David?
I thought the same thing as Diane when you used the word responsibility. I started thinking of all of our responsibilities to our readers. In terms of the reader's responsibility to us or to themselves or to society in reading about science, I think that one of the things that comes first to mind is that they have a responsibility to be hard on us, to be demanding, to demand real reporting, to demand accuracy, to demand validated fact and quotation, and also have high expectations about artfulness. I don't think they should roll over and accept second-class work from us. They should really, really push us to report accurately and shape beautiful literary works.
Well, bearing in mind that it's about people and it has a narrative and it's a hopeful story at the end.
And our
It's not
responsibility
just about
is,
disease.
Right, and our responsibility is to entertain them
Yeah.
and make the pages turn as well as informing them.
Dan?
Yeah, I think that's really true. I also thought you were going a different way with that question. And, people are busy. People have full lives. They have a whole wide range of responsibilities and priorities. And we are in this very blessed position of being investigators and explorers and explainers. And so the responsibility is ours not to blow that. And that's what I try to tell my students. It's what I try to practice myself. I mean, there's a lot of tut-tutting about scientific illiteracy and about our refusal to accept the reality of climate change, for example. But really, I find that as sort of a kind of a dead end to pursue, and I think it's much more interesting and fruitful to flip the equation and say, what do we need to be doing? What can we do to bring the scientific reality to large audiences? And it's a privilege and also a great responsibility not to be too preachy about it. More than anything else, it's just a hell of a lot of fun. And sometimes we, in our seriousness of purpose, we sometimes miss the fun aspect. We have a lot of problems in this democracy. We know this. But almost every problem that we face is solvable, and is solvable via information. And so people who purvey information have a kind of a solemn, sacred responsibility.
Well, then let me evolve the question.
I actually think the readers do have a responsibility. Sorry,
Oh, good.
I'll
Go
answer.
ahead. Well,
So,
if you could reference what you learned about
Yeah.
the interplay between ethics and science and law, that's really such a powerful piece in your book.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways, like Dan said, no book is about one thing, and my book is about a lot of things, and one of the things it's about is communication about science and what can go wrong when it fails. Because basically everything that happened to the Lacks family that was traumatic for them happened because someone didn't or couldn't communicate something to them, but also because they, in some situations, couldn't hear it. They were just shut down to asking questions. They were terrified, which was no fault of their own. It's just sort of part of a much larger story. But in a lot of ways, that story is about why it's important that we do what we do, why it's important that readers are open to receiving it. And I think that everything I write about is usually at this intersection where science impacts daily life, where things get messy and where there's just no easy answer. And I think the one thing that I've come to with, as I have traveled and talked about this book and this story, is I feel like one of the responsibilities that readers have, I mean, being skeptical, which is sort of one of the things you were talking about, I think is essential, but also not demanding easy answers from science. And I hear over and over again, people want me to say, but was this right or was this wrong? Do they deserve money? Do they not deserve money? You know, were the scientists bad or were they good? And you cannot say that. And really, at its core, science is about, it is always messy, and there is never a sort of right wrong. It's always being revised. You know, does red wine prevent cancer or does it cure cancer? Does it, you know, and I think the public's demand for, like, you know, this solid answer with science can often get the public in trouble, and it also, journalists get into trouble because then they want to, they try to answer those questions and the answers don't always exist. And so I think being open to learning about science while also being open to the fact that, yeah, the answers may not be as clear as you want them to be, and they often probably aren't exactly what you want them to be, and that, you know, and when it changes a year from now, that doesn't mean that everything before it was sort of a scam and it was wrong. It means that's how science works. Right. They follow the facts, and this is what the facts are right now, and then somebody goes, oh wait, those facts were wrong. Like, that data that we've always believed was the fact, it was actually wrong, and so we revise it. And so science, just like science writing, is all about following the story and being open to where it's taking you, rather than to trying to put a structure on it from the outside. And so I see people trying to do that when they read science stories. They want to instill some kind of structure that can't exist often.
And John, we have this problem of confirmation bias.
Yeah.
That we all have, both as communicators and the people who read or listen and watch our work. And this is a huge responsibility for all of us. Yeah. And that is to truly be open to new information. You know, to truly be open to the possibility that what we have always believed, or what we believed for the last week, or since we were in high school, or whatever it is, that it might be wrong. That everything is open to revision. That the whole nature,
even about Tom Brady.
Yeah, even Tom Brady. Actually, you know what?
And I was the ethics question. I think the one other thing that I think about in terms of responsibility as writers and readers is to not just be universal science cheerleaders, and also not be universal science haters. And people tend to fall in one camp. Science is awesome. Everything science does is awesome, and it's not. So, science does some bad things sometimes. It doesn't always do bad things, which is sort of the other camp I see. And that's where the skepticism comes in. It's not just to always assume scientists are evil or gods, which people kind of tend to go one way or other, but they're human, and science, you know.
Science doesn't do bad things.
Right.
Science is just a process, right. But scientists are human beings. They're very subject to confirmation bias, to what the pressures of whatever their cultural milieu is, just like the rest of us. And so a big role of science journalists, of science writers, is to help the world, help the public see the difference between the scientific process, which is a beautiful, it would be wrong to call it perfect, but it's a magnificent construction of civilization. Scientists are anything but perfect, and so it's really, really important for science communicators to make that distinction.
Neal, you want to grab any of that before we take questions?
Well, I'm in I'm always torn between the side of me that reads random Facebook posts and Twitter arguments and seething with rage. You know, why can't these people think more carefully? You know, why don't they appreciate or understand science? And the part of me that needs to make a living writing books and getting people to read them. So people, I mean, at the end of the day, novels are entertainment, and if I write anything in a kind of finger-shaking, hectoring tone, that's not very entertaining. It's not going to work.
That works for any of us.
What's that?
I said I don't think that works for any of us.
Yeah, that's so. The best that I can do is to sort of beguile readers into getting science and being interested in science by trying to tell stories about scientists in which they're portrayed, not as the remote weirdo nerd in the Imitation Game, but as the more human kind of person with good and bad points, with flaws and with virtues, and to portray the kind of journey that they go on and the processes that they have to go through. And I think that those stories read better and read more true the closer they are to what actual scientists go through. So that's kind of what I'm aiming for. I'm not saying I always hit that mark, but that's kind of the approach that I take. Not in trying to impose a responsibility on a reader, but maybe trying to get them to see things from a science-oriented point of view, and maybe voluntarily take that responsibility on their own shoulders.
I like the idea very much of beguiler as a job description there as well, especially since so much of what we're learning about science and nature these days is very limited because it's over the internet and it's mainly visual, and you don't really fill in the rest of the senses.
Yeah. The only part of that I'm a little uncomfortable with is that somehow the idea of beguiling can take us away from reality, sort of say we're going to construct this sort of magical story. And for those of us in nonfiction, that can be an uncomfortable place sometimes. That can be distortive in the same way that emphasizing, only the negative, the apocalyptic narrative can be distorting as well. The heroic narrative can be distorting. All these things can be distorting. And I think being beguiling can also be distortive.
Yeah, I guess I have a license to beguile because I've read stuff that isn't true.
But the truth
You
can
need a
be
t-shirt
beguiling
that license to
too.
beguile.
Yeah.
The truth can be beguiling too, and it can also, just as narrative doesn't have to be big dramatic things. Sensations are also narrative experiences.
Well, what do you think of Orson Welles, not Orson Welles, H.G. Wells, who wrote history, who wrote...
Even with War of the Worlds.
Yeah. But he wrote science fiction, but he was also a commentator and a nonfiction writer as well. Do you think they clash?
I don't know. I mean, I have to go back and read his stuff from specifically that point of view. He's an interesting dude.
Standards of fact-checking were pretty low in those days.
Yeah. He wrote a history of the world, though, before he died. It was one of his last works. It was going 900 pages.
It's really a kind of a core question about what is science writing for? What is science storytelling for? And it is sometimes to beguile, it's sometimes to entertain. But if it's nonfiction, it really must always be to get as close to reality as we can get. And sometimes that's not quite as entertaining as we would like it to be, although it's our responsibility to make it as entertaining as we can.
Well, we have taken more than your time and the time that was allotted for us, and clearly we could hang out here and talk for quite some time, and you've been such an attentive, wonderful audience. Let's give our panel of authors a round of applause. Thanks to Diane Ackerman, Quammen, Neal, Stephenson, John Fagin, and Rebecca Skloot. Thanks so much.